A sufficient second? There is, and certainly appears to be, a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air as the Senate holds its final vote on President Biden's historic nominee for the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. If confirmed, Jackson would be the first black female justice, only the third black justice in American history, replacing longtime liberal Justice Stephen Breyer, who was retiring after 27 years on the bench. Her confirmation hearings were not without drama, with Democrats praising her qualifications and record and some Republicans accusing her of being lenient in her sentencing of criminals. Now it is the full Senate voting. All Democrats expected to vote for her, as well as 3 Republicans who have pledged their support: Susan Collins of Maine, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Right now, they're about midway through the vote, each senator shouting out yay or nay when called upon. As we watch the tallying increase here, Garrett Haake is watching all this from Capitol Hill. Garrett?
Lester, Democrats really had 2 goals here, along with the confirmation of Judge Jackson. They wanted to move quickly, and they wanted a bipartisan vote. They're going to achieve both today. Judge Jackson will be confirmed 38 days after she was initially nominated. That's fast, but not record-breakingly so. Amy Coney Barrett, the most recent justice, was approved in a shorter timeline. But in this case, Democrats know that Judge Jackson won't take the bench until the fall anyway. Regardless, they wanted to get her confirmed before the Easter break that will begin basically the moment this vote is done. And then, as you already alluded to, this vote's going to be bipartisan. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have both supported the vast majority of Joe Biden's judicial nominees. The surprise here was Mitt Romney, the Republican of Utah, choosing to join them in the speeches leading up to this vote. He's gotten a lot of praise from his fellow lawmakers who compared his vote to the actions of his father, George Romney, the governor of Michigan, breaking with his party to support this candidate right here, Lester, but the drama of this vote appears to be done with those three Republicans set to join all Democrats.
All right, Garrett, again, a voice vote. We're watching it right now in the Senate chambers. As we do, let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, I suspect I know what the TVs are tuned to right now at the White House. Will we hear from the president today?
Well, we're not going to hear from the president on camera today, but it's likely we'll hear from him in the form of some statement. The press secretary delaying her briefing to reporters today so that the White House, the staff, and those other officials could watch this historic moment, what Chuck Schumer described as one of the great moments in American history. Lester, the White House is casting this as the fulfillment of a promise the president made to the country. It was just over 2 years ago that then candidate Biden said that he would, if he was elected as president, nominate the first black woman to the Supreme Court. He has followed through on that, and it looks that it will become official just moments from now. And it does appear likely that President Biden will host an event here at the White House tomorrow to celebrate Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Not entirely clear what lawmakers would be here, notably several lawmakers who were with the president in the course of the last 48 hours. The House Speaker Nancy Pelosi among them have just tested positive for COVID-19. Nonetheless, this is a moment that the White House is celebrating this new soon-to-be justice as a woman of deep qualifications and a strong personal story. She will have been confirmed for the fourth time by the Senate today, and she is someone whose following grew, the support of Americans grew over the course of her testimony before the American public. Buster.
All right, just a handful of senators yet to vote here. Yamiche Alcindor is our Washington correspondent. Yamiche, the Biden administration had to make some calculations about this nominee. What were they, and how did they play out ultimately?
The Biden administration wanted a nominee who was going to be a consensus builder, someone who was going to be able to get bipartisan support, but also someone who is going to fulfill that incredible and very important promise that President Biden made, which was to be an African-American woman and a woman who was going to be smart, who was going to have the background for this position, but also someone who was going to be able to be poised during what was going to be, they thought, a grueling confirmation process. And they got someone who remained poised during a confirmation process that included all sorts of attacks from, frankly, Republicans. They wanted to paint her as being soft on crime. They at one point tried to say that she was going to be leaning into propaganda for critical race theory, but she stood firm, and people who were close to her told me that they were not surprised that she was able to do as well in these confirmation processes. They say that she is someone who her friends and people around her thought that she was destined to be on the Supreme Court. This moment, of course, is 233 years in the making, and she is shattering a double-pane glass ceiling as a black woman. Her friends tell me that she was someone who took her studies very, very seriously, and she was someone who wanted very much to be a judge, but also wanted to be someone who would listen to other people who did not always agree with her, something that she's going to have to be doing on the Supreme Court, and they just say that she is someone who is ready to do just that.
All right, Yamiche, thank you. The vote right now stands 53-46 in favor of confirmation. We should note that Senator Rand Paul, we're being told, is not in the chamber right now, so this is not an official tally. There is still one more vote to go, Senator Rand Paul. While we watch that play out, let's go to our justice correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete, assuming this confirmation goes through, what's going to be on her plate as she joins the court?
Well, a couple of notes, Lester. First of all, if it is 53 votes in her favor, that's a greater majority. That's one more vote than either Clarence Thomas got in 1991 or Amy Coney Barrett got 2 years ago. It's 3 more votes than Brett Kavanaugh got. So it's not by any means the closest Supreme Court vote. It's a more comfortable margin than some recent nominees have had. Second, Lester, I have to say that she is not going to be a Supreme Court justice until Stephen Breyer leaves the court. She may get a ceremonial swearing in tomorrow at the White House, the constitutional oath, but she has to take 2 oaths to become a justice. She also has to take the judicial oath, and they can't give her that until Stephen Breyer leaves the court and makes room for her to get on the court, which will be in late June or early July when the Supreme Court finishes handing down the remaining decisions from this term. These sorts of overlaps are unusual, but she's making history in yet another way. This is the longest such overlap between the time a person is actually confirmed by the Senate and before they can take their place on the court. But she will have the whole summer to get ready, which is more time than most Supreme Court incoming freshman justices get. Now, one question she's going to have to face is whether she will, as she said in her confirmation hearings, recuse or not take part in one of the blockbuster cases of next term, and that's a challenge to affirmative action in college admissions. The challenge comes from Harvard. She's not only a Harvard graduate, but she serves on a policymaking board at Harvard, and she said in her confirmation hearing she'd probably recuse from that case. The Supreme Court will also next year be looking at voting rights again. There's another case involving congressional redistricting and how the Voting Rights Act affects that. That's been a big issue the Supreme Court has already had to deal with in a couple of cases this term, and it'll be around next term. And there's also a big civil rights case next term, Lester, and that's this question of whether religiously oriented businesses have a religious right to refuse to serve same-sex LGBT customers. That's a question the Supreme Court has ducked over the last several years and has decided to take up next term.
All right, Pete, thank you. Again, we're not quite there to the end of the vote. Let's go to Garrett Hake right now. He's watching this for us from Capitol Hill. Garrett, what's the holdup right now?
Lester, we're waiting on Rand Paul. The Republican senator from Kentucky is the lone senator to not vote yet today. He did vote in an earlier vote series this morning, so we know he's in Washington. We know he was present at least earlier today. This kind of thing, unfortunately, happens all the time in House and Senate votes. Somebody misses the memo on timing, or they don't rush to the floor. Typically, the floor will be kept open for some period of time to try to give, especially in the Senate, that offending lawmaker as much time as possible to cast their vote. But it's possible at some point this vote will be deemed left open long enough. It's a pure judgment call, and this vote will be closed without him expressing his no vote, which was, guaranteed at this point on the matter.
Garrett, Republicans in the hearings tried to paint Judge Brown Jackson as soft on sentencing, soft on certain crimes. They made a calculation there. What's the mood now? Coming down to this vote, knowing the votes were there, what was the mood among Republicans?
Republicans knew really from the word go that they were probably not going to be able to defeat this nominee. If Democrats all stuck together in this 50-50 Senate, you would have had a 50-50 confirmation vote with Kamala Harris breaking the tie, and Supreme Court politics becoming what they have become, especially over the last several nominations. It was all but assured from the get-go that this would be the case. The Republicans wanted to take some of the shine off whomever Joe Biden chose to nominate. They might argue that they did so here, but obviously they lost 3 of their own members who crossed over in favor of Judge Jackson, voting for her. And I did hear from both Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski over these last couple of weeks a bit of a backlash to the way that Judge Jackson's confirmation was handled by some Republicans. They found the line of questioning about child predators and child pornography sentencing to be unfair and distasteful and overly politicized, that partially contributing to this bipartisan vote today.
Garrett, thank you. As we wait for Senator Paul to return to the chambers and to vote, let me go back to Yamiche. And we're talking about the history here, and it is profound. But what's the practical matter of the first black woman justice on the Supreme Court?
The practical matter is that this will be the first time that someone with her lived experiences will be able to serve on the Supreme Court, and it's not a coincidence. Civil rights activists that I've been talking to ahead of this vote tell me that that we as a country need to recognize that this was a position that was denied to black women, and here she is going to come and be able to have the conversation with her fellow justices about what it's like to be a descendant of enslaved people, what it's like to be a woman who is also balancing, of course, her life as a mother, but also her life as a wife, but also her life as someone who has a substantial amount of public defense and criminal justice background. I'm also told by her friends that when they think about the moment and the history that she's making, that she is, they say, the perfect person to make this, because she's someone who has had a nuanced experience in America. She had an uncle who served time in prison, but she also had a brother and family members who were themselves police officers and police chiefs. She's someone who is also has balanced a lot of adversity in her own life and has also helped other friends through adversity. One of her friends was telling me about how she, even while she was going through the confirmation process, was texting her friends at 2 o'clock in the morning, responding to things that their children were doing and that was going on and things that were going on in her and their lives. So in some ways, she is someone who is making history, as they say, her friends, as someone who is both understanding of the ordinary stereotypes and challenges that Black women have to deal with, but also someone who has excelled past so many things, as both a double Harvard graduate, but also someone who has been really ascending in judicial nominees and in judicial positions here. So this is a moment where so many people who know her are emotional, and they're also in some ways feeling that this is a great end to what was a painful process. Garrett talked about the confirmation hearings, and so many of her friends went to the Senate to sit behind her, to have her back, they say, during those hearings, but that she was someone who had to weather this alone, and also someone who got emotional just at the very end, that single tear when Senator Booker was talking about the fact that she was a great American and that he told her that she should not worry because this was her place in history to have. So this is a moment that the nation is definitely taking in as a profound moment, but also a moment that is very much underscoring what a lot of African American women, they say, have to go through, which is a lot of adversity to get to a place as high as this.
All right, Yamiche, thanks very much. If you're just joining us, you're looking at the Senate chambers, the Senate voting on the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be the next Associate Justice in the Supreme Court. The holdup appears to be Senator Rand Paul, Republican Senator Paul, who's not present right now for that voice vote. So where things stand now, 53-46 in favor of confirmation. But of course, still Rand Paul to vote before we see an official tally there. Let's go to Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander. And Peter, we've been talking about history. Let's not forget, presiding over this is Vice President Harris, who knows a thing or two about history as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Not only is she the first Black vice president of the United States, she serves as the president, as vice president, the president of the Senate. So this is a historic moment for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the first Black vice president of the United States presiding over the confirmation of the first Black woman soon to be Justice of the Supreme Court, the nation's highest court, a moment certainly not lost. The vice president often presides over close votes. This one, though, as evidenced by Murkowski and Collins and Mitt Romney, making it clear that they would vote in support of her, was not going to be close enough that her vote would be necessary here. But it was a historic moment that the White House indicated that she wanted to be a part of, there to witness. So there is some more history that we're watching here today. I think as we watch this, the White House, in conversations I've had with folks here, have really emphasized the uniqueness of this moment, not just the deep qualifications of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, but also the unique perspective that she is going to bring to the court. For one, there will now be 4 women on the Supreme Court, all 3 of the more liberal-leaning justices, Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and with the departure of Stephen Breyer, soon to be Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, as the 3 women, in addition to Amy Coney Barrett, as noted before. But also she is 32 years younger than Judge Breyer, for whom she clerked in the past. So she provides a youthfulness to the court around the private conference table where the conversations are happening among these justices, will provide a different perspective. The first former federal public defender. Obviously, this is someone who had served throughout the ranks of the judiciary. She has great experience serving on the bench, although barely a year that she has served, less than a year that she has served on the bench on which she now sits here in Washington, D.C. And of course, what we'll be watching, Rand Paul can be late to this vote. He can delay it, but he can't block it from taking place, is the 3 Republicans who have voted in support. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, they did support her vote to the appellate court just about a year ago. Lindsey Graham was the other Republican who did at the time. He has said and has now voted no this time around. Mitt Romney joining those 2 women voting in favor, saying that she was a well-qualified nominee and, in his words, a person of honor. Lester?
All right, Peter, let's get a little more information about what is holding up the completion of this vote. Garrett Haake is watching this for us from Capitol Hill, and I understand we've done some checking on the senator's whereabouts.
Yeah, Lester, this is pretty unusual. We just had a producer run down the hall to Rand Paul's office, which is just a few floors down from where I'm standing right now. Knocked on the door. At first, no one answered, and then some junior staffers came to the door, asked for the names of our team members here, took a business card and closed the door right back in their faces. Didn't answer questions about where the senator is or if he's aware there's a vote for a Supreme Court justice happening right now. This is a 15-minute vote. Now, Senate votes in particular are usually kept open, sometimes for long periods of time, on a gentleman's agreement to try to give everyone the maximum opportunity to vote, especially when the schedule is uncertain. In this case, the schedule for this vote was set last night. No one could possibly have been confused about when this vote was going to occur, and the official 15 minutes of it have now passed. So the fact that this vote is being left open now is largely as a courtesy to Senator Paul if he wants to show up and have his vote counted on a Supreme Court nominee, usually one of the premier things that senators get a chance to weigh in on behalf of their constituents.
And we expect, by the way, a no vote from Senator Paul on this.
Yes, we do.
All right, we'll continue to watch that play out. That time has expired. You see the senators milling about, waiting perhaps for that voice vote to continue. And that, of course, would lead to the official confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The votes as they are right now would make that confirmation official, but still waiting again for Senator Paul. Let me go back to Yamiche. Yamiche, you have to start wondering now whether there's a statement being made here.
That is a key question here. Garrett's reporting that the senator's aides closed the door and would not answer questions during this historic vote really does say something. And it really, in some ways, begs the question of, is this going to be yet another hurdle, another unusual thing that's happening to Judge Jackson as she tries to make history, and as she will make history. As Garrett said, this vote will happen. She will be confirmed based on the vote count. But it is, in some ways, an unsettling it's an unsettling development. In some ways, it reminds me of the conversations that I've been having with Black women who say that they've had to navigate all sorts of hurdles, all sorts of, they say, indignities in order to achieve what they want, in order to achieve the things that they've earned and that they deserve. So here is now another moment where Washington is sort of scratching its head, wondering what in the world is going on while we wait for the justice to be confirmed, or the judge, I should say, to be confirmed. She's not a justice just yet.
Yeah, let me go back to Garrett. I think he has an update. Garrett.
Lester, I can tell you that Senator Paul has been spotted at what we call the carriage entrance to the U.S. Capitol, just off the Senate floor, where cars can pull up and deposit their lawmakers just a few feet from the floor. If that is in fact the case, we should be seeing him come to the door on the viewer's far left any minute now.
All right, keep us posted on that. We've got the camera trained there as well. Let's go back to Peter Alexander at the White House. And Peter, any reaction to this so far of what we've seen and what appears to be about to happen?
No, none yet from the White House. Obviously, they have delayed their events this afternoon, at least the public-facing events, with the press secretary, Jen Psaki, expected to come out as soon as this confirmation wrapped up to make the first public statement on behalf of the president, on behalf of this White House. And I think behind the scenes, there's certainly a frustration that Rand Paul would be in the one holding up this vote. But we'll take a listen.
Hold on a second. I think he's there. Okay, Senator Paul is there, and he just voted no, and so that would appear to be the end of the voting. But we'll wait to hear from Vice President Harris, who is presiding here. There is some procedural issues they have to go through and check the count before announcing the final tally. And there is Vice President Harris now.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
And so Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has been formally confirmed by the U.S. Senate to vote 53 to 47. All Democrats voting in favor of the confirmation, along with 3 Republicans. So it can be considered a bipartisan vote in favor of confirmation. A historic moment, the first black woman vice president of the United States, giving that final tally, 53 to 47, propelling Ketanji Brown Jackson to be the first black woman justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Let me go back to you, Amish, and reflect on this moment.
This is a profound moment that took 233 years to achieve as a country. This is a jubilant moment for so many people who were supporting her and supporting the idea of her before she was the one who was chosen, the idea of a black woman ascending to the highest court of the land. So many of her friends and those closest to her told me today that they see this as really inspirational to so many other black women and people of color and women across our country, people who want to be following in her footsteps. This is a moment that Ketanji Brown Jackson herself, now on her way to being Justice Jackson, leaned into, reminding people that she is a descendant of enslaved people, that her name Ketanji is African. Her friends often told me that she was someone who made sure people knew how to say her name because she wanted to have pride in the heritage and of her ancestors. So this is a moment for our country to really, in some ways, reflect on not only this achievement, but also the barriers that exist for so many others that are continuing to try to achieve the sort of things that she has now achieved. And I should say one other thing, which is that some of her friends also told me that representation isn't always everything, that representation and having her on the court is a start, but that institutions and so many other things in our country need to change for what we see here today to be, to reach its full potential and mattering in our society.
And as our friend Pete Williams pointed out a moment ago, Justice Breyer has not vacated that seat yet, so it will be likely sometime early midsummer before Ketanji Brown Jackson becomes officially sworn in as a member of the Supreme Court. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent now, Peter Alexander. Peter, any reaction to that final tally?
Well, the reaction comes in the form of a hug from the president himself to the soon-to-be Justice of the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Of course, she'll be seated on the bench upon the retirement of Stephen Breyer. We have just learned, as cameras were invited into the room, the Roosevelt Room here at the White House, that President Biden was with the judge inside the White House as they watched this final vote taking place by a 53 to 47 margin. Her confirmation, other senior staff, we were told, were also in the room. We were just getting those photographs, and as soon as we have them, we will share with you. Separately, the White House just moments ago announced that tomorrow it will extend this celebration with a 12:15 Eastern time celebration of her confirmation to take place on the South Lawn here at the White House, with remarks from both President Biden himself and Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's going to be sort of a 2-day affair. This has been going on for a matter of months. It's something the president has thought about for years, dating back to his time having served as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And now tomorrow, well, I guess today and ultimately tomorrow, in person in front of America, the two will stand and a chance to celebrate this historic achievement. And what the president has said is an opportunity to make the court look a bit more like America. Obviously, the first black woman soon to be seated as a justice of the United States highest court. Lester.
All right, Peter, thank you. NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson joins us. Hallie, reflect, if you will, on the vote and of course, with the knowledge that this does not change the ideological balance of the court.
That's right. You have a judge, who is considered to be joining the more liberal wing of the Supreme Court. So ideologically, it's not going to make a big difference, expected not to, on some of these would tend to be closer cut decisions, right? A 5-4 decision, for example. 6-3 is the split that we've typically seen. That is unlikely to change. And Lester, you know, beyond, I think, what you and Yamiche and Peter and Garrett have talked about, the historical sweep of this moment here, one of the things I'm looking at is the political undertone of this, right? Because, yes, the White House can tomorrow at this celebration Peter is referencing talk about how this was a bipartisan moment for them. And it absolutely is. It is also not overwhelmingly bipartisan, right? It is 3 Republicans who have joined here, the Democrats. And that's not how it always used to be, right? It wasn't always the case that we would see this close of a vote on something as important and as big of a deal as a Supreme Court justice. What you have seen, though, as that has happened, right, and you've heard even some of these Republicans and many Democrats decry what they describe as the overly political process now, the confirmation process that we've been covering here over this last month or so. That has eroded public support in the institution of the Supreme Court overall, it seems. When you look at some of these numbers, you look at, for example, Gallup with the Supreme Court trust hitting an all-time low just last year, 40% of Americans viewing the institution itself favorably. That is something that could have longer-term ramifications down the road, Lester, as we continue to see more openings on the court and more confirmation processes.
Hallie Jackson. Hallie, thanks so much. That is going to conclude our coverage for now. We'll have much more on this historic vote and Supreme Court confirmation tonight on Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt. Thank you for joining us.
Where the sisters are, but the only one that was kidnapped was Sister Sue Ellen. We suspect they were looking for money and medicine.
Sue Ellen had served in New Orleans since 1956. In 2014, that call to serve drew her to West Africa's Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, now facing a humanitarian crisis due in part to a prolonged drought.
She went over there because it was such an impoverished village, and she thought she could help.
The Archdiocese